Welcome back to the Indian Wisdom Podcast. I'm Dr. Raj. After a year of podcasting, yes, the podcast is now 1 year old. We took a couple weeks off to sort of reflect and recenter and regroup and rethink, and we'll move forward in similar vein, um, focusing on story narrative as a cornerstone of this podcast, interspersed with which you'll find little nuggets here and wisdom bombs there and good fun all around. Rather than being released on Thursdays, and this podcast will now be released as with this episode, beginning with this episode on Mondays. Monday Fun Day. Part of the reason for that is because Thursdays is when I release my other podcast on the New Books Network. I host the Indian Religions channel of the New Books Network, where I cover cutting edge scholarship in the overarching field of Hindu studies, Indian studies more broadly. So maybe you want to check that out. But today, for this new cycle of the Hinduism podcast, we'll be talking about this little thing called consciousness and this state of consciousness that we consider sleep. Right? We'll be talking about Viṣṇu and his yogic slumber, Viṣṇu's meditative sleep. In various strands of Indic tradition, there are considered to be four states of consciousness, right? We can refine these further and diversify this somewhat, but nevertheless, the four states that we can commonly understand are waking consciousness, this sort of wide awake problem solving consciousness, depending on how much coffee is in the mug and or what we were doing the night before and how much sleep we got. You have waking consciousness, that in which probably you are listening to this podcast at present. There's also a state of consciousness that we call sleep, right? But sleep has two aspects. There's dreaming consciousness, sleep with dreams, and then deep sleep, where there are no dreams. And then the fourth state of consciousness is something quite extraordinary. It is a transpersonal state that is beyond the consciousness of the individual state. Perhaps we can call this cosmic consciousness. Yes. What I find utterly fascinating is that while sleep is a metaphor commonly used to represent ignorance, because it's a corollary of the metaphor of being awakened, being used for knowledge or insight or awareness. So being awakened versus being asleep. While the sleeping state or being asleep is often tantamount to ignorance or materiality or functional materiality, we see that there is a sort of divine sleep. Sleep is often mythologized as divine state. Now, what could this mean? How do we understand this? I'll tell shortly a story about Viṣṇu. The story is also from the stories behind the poses. There are a handful of stories left from the stories behind the poses that have not been covered in this podcast. And once they are finished, we'll see what tales there are to tell. If you have requests, by all means, let me know. Check it out. Check out in the podcast notes how you can reach me, or maybe send an email to Raj at rajbalkaran.com. But today we talk about Viṣṇu. And Viṣṇu, the name Viṣṇu comes from the Sanskrit verbal root to pervade. So one captivating way to think of Viṣṇu, especially for Vaishnavas, is as all-pervasive consciousness, the consciousness which pervades the cosmos, right? The universe as we know it. The idea that consciousness pervades the universe is very different from this much more Western, modern idea, I would say, that consciousness emerges from the individual and the evolutionary properties of that individual's neurophysiology. Right? This is something that is hugely investigated, debated, contested in terms of the interesting, as is considered in West, a hard problem of consciousness. This is not a hard problem. This is not a hard problem at all. If you've got the right precepts, it's not a hard problem in the least. Um, but it is complex without question. But when you begin with matter, you struggle to make sense of consciousness. When you begin with consciousness, the struggle does not arise in the same way. If we can understand consciousness as a field that we tap into, then you can much more cogently account for human experience than if we um, envision it as emergent from neuroscience, right? There's a lot to be unpacked there. And I'm sure you all have your own opinions, your own insights. Having said that, anyone who thinks that awareness is tied specifically to your body is not paying attention to their own capacity to become aware of what's around them and to even become aware of people who are very far away from them, especially people that are close to. For centuries and centuries, people would have intuitive knowing across the ocean, across the Atlantic, for example. This is not uncommon to this day. We can often, if we're not completely distracted, which actually is often the case, we often are completely distracted, it seems more and more. But for those of us who are not completely distracted, we are able to discern when loved ones are in need or in pain. There's nothing paranormal about this, although maybe it is by definition paranormal, but this is very normal paranormal. It's only the para is because it does not neatly fit into our model of how matter should function. The extent to which we can become aware of whether a loved one is suffering or a great deal more information than that. And really, any spiritual adept knows this, and the more evolved or advanced they are, the more expanded their consciousness beyond their individuated body consciousness. And the more palpable it is that consciousness is not tied to our experience of it. Right? So it all depends on your stance and your starting point and your suppositions and your cultural prejudices, frankly. Right? Viṣṇu represents all pervasive consciousness. Yes. He's the awareness that pervades creation. This is one compelling way to think of Viṣṇu as a mythologization of all pervasive consciousness. So he is the preserver, creation's preserver. Right? So when Shiva performs his divine dance of destruction and the universe is dissolved back into the primordial oceans, we've talked about this again and again because this happens again and again, apparently, the cyclical model of dissolving and emerging universes. Okay? So Shiva does his blissful dance of destruction, dissolve all things into the primordial ocean, and then it is Viṣṇu who is sprawled out upon the oceanic expanse, sprawled out upon what? Upon his serpent couch, Ananta, the unending serpent couch. There's a relatively recent episode unpacking the extent to which that serpent couch represents or can be said to represent Kundalini Shakti, right? The dormant serpent power that pervades the cosmos. Okay, so he's got his Kundalini couch, if you will, serpent couch, and he's sprawled out on the cosmic ocean in a state of sleep, in his yoga nidra state. This state is beyond the waking state and beyond the dreaming state as well. This is a deep and dreamless sleep where the mind is silent. This is where Viṣṇu retires once the cycle of creation has been completed. He reawakens when, by the grace of Lord Brahma, a new cycle dawns. Creations rise and fall like waves on a cosmic ocean, without beginning and without end. As time and self, as time and space themselves are dissolved into that primordial ocean, there is no place, no space, no physical space, no time, no space for Vishnu to retire. We could think of it in terms of the story world as a location, but this isn't a location proper because space and time have been dissolved. This is actually a state. It's a symbolic representation of a state of consciousness. Okay. And this is his yogic slumber. This is his yogic sleep. Again, it's fascinating that sleep can be both an obstruction and obfuscation of consciousness, as when the veil is pulled over the eyes of the one who hopes to see. And sleep in a couple key narratives is actually divinized, right? Particularly in a story in the Devi Mahatmya, the greatness of the goddess, where she herself is the yoga nidra of Vishnu. She herself is that magical Maya, that power of delusion, illusion, creativity, which blinds individuated beings from the collective consciousness, because to be individuated is to be separate from the collective consciousness, which is ultra illusory, but absolutely necessary for advancing your particular journey, for maintaining and evolving your unique perspective. Yes. So at this point in a sort of space time, at this state, almost all souls remain in a state of suspended animation until the dawning of the next creation. Right? For only one embodied being has ever been able to survive the cosmic dissolution. So this is the story of this one person, Sage Markandeya, who has been able to survive in body, to remain embodied across cycles of creation. You have heard the story of Markandeya before, I'm sure, on this podcast, perhaps elsewhere. But as you might recall, Markandeya's parents were childless. And so they perform great austerity, great penance to the great god Shiva in order to receive a boon. And Shiva says, okay, how can I boon you? How can I bless you? And they're like, we want a child. And like, well, you kind of have enough punya, enough good karma to have a long-lived dullard, sort of difficult son, or a lovely, sweet, brilliant sage who will live to be 16 years old. And of course, they pick the latter. And so the story goes towards Markandeya's 16th birthday, little Marky indeed, towards his 16th birthday. His parents are upset because they know what's coming, and they confess what the situation is. And he is not phased at all because he's a sage, right? He fully accepts that we are all going to die. But death is not real because the we who we think is going to die is not real. We are transient. And if we identify with that transience, then yes, it will come to an end. If we learn how to identify with our permanence, it will not come to an end. Right? So being a sage, he's sort of, clearly he's listened to some good podcasts and watched some good YouTube videos and maybe had a decent teacher or two here or there. And he's not fazed by this. He accepts that, everyone's got their curtain call, right? And the curtain will close. All the world's a stage indeed. So he sets out to worship Shiva for the remaining time he has left on Earth. He performs rituals and chants Shiva's sacred mantra before a holy Shiva lingam. And at this time, the sun setting on the final day of his life, as per Shiva's prophecy, Lord Yama, the god of death, approaches with his noose in order to ensnare Markandeya and take him to the underworld. There's probably some interesting sorting center there in terms of, where you end up next. So he decides to ensnare Markandeya. His noose surrounds not only Markandeya, but Shiva's holy lingam, and Shiva appears and says, Yama, you've got to remove your noose from my lingam because I'm eternal, I'm immortal, and I'm not subject to death. And Yama is a little sheepish and probably a little afraid because Shiva's the great destroyer and he's extraordinarily powerful, and nobody wishes to suffer the consequences of his wrath. So Yama says, "Look, I'm so sorry, Lord Shiva, but I'm just doing essentially your bidding. Your blessing created this karma, and we're all instruments of karma, and I've got to usher in Markandeya to the underworld. Because this is the expiration date today." And Shiva's like, "Okay, don't worry about that. I'm going to bless Markandeya with eternal life. He will be forever young, forever 16, forever and ever and ever and ever and ever." And this is Shiva's blessing, right? So after, centuries, indeed millennia of teaching and blessing people on earth, Markandeya retires to deep meditation for the remainder of the age, becoming oblivious to all that was around him. Then one day he notices a strong gust of wind which grows in intensity. Torrential rain begins to fall. The storm becomes a hurricane. The rivers soon overstep their bounds and inundate the land. Whirlpools form and a great flood occurs upon the earth. Markandeya is tossed and turned by the tempestuous waves about him. From the crest of a very tall wave, he spots a great banyan tree. But what a glorious image. Yeah. In the crest of a tall wave amid this tsunami, amid this tumult, he spots a banyan tree glowing magnificently, untouched by the storm. He is drawn by the dazzling splendor of its mysterious presence and fights his way towards it in reverence and in awe. As Markandeya approaches the banyan, he notices that its radiance is coming from one single branch. Looking even closer, he sees, in fact, an infant nestled amid that branch, amid the branches, sitting on the very branch from which the radiance is emerging. This is what's lighting up the whole scene, lighting up the whole tree. Markandeya draws closer, mesmerized by the glowing child. The child laughs playfully, and with one of his inhalations, Markandeya is sucked into his mouth. The sage is awestruck to behold the sun, moon, and stars in great galaxy within the infant's mouth. He saw too the landscapes of earth, mountains, forests, deserts, tundra, every known flora and fauna and class of creature populated the infant's mouth. The ages went by in the twinkling of an eye, and Markandeya was left breathless by this divine vision. Now, there's another story of the same divine vision for those of you who know the story of Yashoda. Mother Yashoda looking into the mouth of Krishna because he was called out for eating mud and he denies it. And she looks at his mouth and she's astonished to see the sun and moon and stars and all creation in the mouth of her child. Even she and herself are in the mouth of her child. It's quite a fascinating image. Okay. So we see this elsewhere. So, as swiftly as a child's breath had sucked him in towards this divine vision, his exhalation pushed him back out, and he found himself again in the presence of the great banyan. Markandeya beheld the child again and knew he must be in the presence of the great god Viṣṇu, the great preserver. The storm had raged around him. That storm which had raged around him, he realized, must be pralaya, the dissolution, the destruction of all things, even space and time at the ending of the age. In the abyss between universes, in the time between ages, Viṣṇu gathers the essence of all creation into himself for their protection, knowing that nothing can survive such ultimate and complete destruction. But Shiva's boon had rendered Markandeya immune even to his own destructive forces, unleashed in fullness. So Markandeya knew then he had been called towards the great god Viṣṇu so that he himself may be preserved. So you have the sage Markandeya who, by virtue of Shiva's boon, actually becomes impervious to Shiva's dance of destruction. He has a vision in the banyan tree of this divine force, this great preserving force that pervades the cosmos, here sort of mythologized as a child, as a baby. in potentia, perhaps to be born anew, to grow into the next stage. And this is the story that we hear for Yoga Nidrasana, right? Yoga Nidra pose. I'll just share a little bit of the commentary from the stories behind the poses about this pose before we close for today. This posture is emblematic of the divine child from Markandeya's vision, coupled with Viṣṇu on a serpent couch in yogic slumber. This is a pose that calls one to withdraw one's awareness and become more compact, to go within. The sleep you are called to is not a state of unconsciousness. Okay, it's altered, but it's not altered towards the absence of consciousness. It's a state of altered consciousness, refined consciousness. You are to fall asleep in the mundane world, and you're to fall asleep to the mundane world, right? And your attachments there too. Viṣṇu slumbers upon a serpent couch, Ananta, which represents dormant Kundalini, sleeping until it is activated at the dawn of creation. Similarly, advanced yogis will feel Kundalini energy flowing through their spine in this pose. But this energy is not to be expanded or expended at this time. Rather, it is to be acknowledged, relished, and internalized, for it will be needed at the dawn of your creation or whatever comes next. So this is the story of slumber. Not just mundane slumber, but divine slumber, an altered state, a yogic trance, if you will. Asleep to the waking world, but not oblivious to consciousness, actually more cognizant, indeed more conscious, an altered state that looks like sleep, that is more conscious than waking consciousness. This is the meditative trance. Yes. Have you experienced altered consciousness that wasn't the result of a substance? What was that like? Well, I'll allow you to contemplate that and other things until next time. Thank you for listening to the Indian Wisdom Podcast. By all means, come study with me at the Indian Wisdom School. I'm Dr. Raj Balkaran, indianwisdomschool.com, or contact me, get in touch at rajbalkaran.com. Until next time, take good care of yourself. Keep listening, keep practicing, keep growing. Namaste.